Welcome to this lecturette on ethical research. The National Association of Social Work has a code of ethics that lays out research as part of your professional responsibility as a practitioner. Specifically, you're to keep current on research and use it to evaluate practice and policies. Some of the key considerations in conducting research revolve around informed consent. Participants need to be told upfront of the risks or benefits of research, as well as being told about their rights as participants, any limits on confidentiality, and what the participation in research will entail. Their participation needs to be voluntary, not coerced. So, for instance, when I do research in prisons, I have to tell the women up front that they can tell me um, certain things that I ask about, but don't tell me any details about unsolved violent crimes, or else I'd have to be compelled by South Carolina law to report that unsolved violent crime. For some research, I could get a waiver from the federal government to keep that confidential in the interest of research because the benefit of the research overall is viewed as the overarching good, and it outweighs the harm that could come from not reporting that unsolved crime. Any risks of the research also need to be outweighed by the benefits. So when I go into an interview with women, I have to ask the guard to see each woman, and the guard goes and gets the woman to participate in the research. And I basically am supposed to tell her about it and let her choose whether she wants to participate. But sometimes the guards misunderstand and don't convey this accurately to the women, and they bring the woman out as if she is being forced to participate in this research. And so I have to then say, no, it's okay, you can actually refuse. So that voluntary participation is important. Being able to hear about all the aspects of what will be involved in the research is important. And knowing about any risks, which are often just things such as embarrassment, but sometimes can be more substantial risks to well-being for particularly medical types of research. So some prisons also don't allow financial incentives, but they allow certain snacks for participation in research. So one of the things I have to do is be clear with women about I can give you this much incentive, and your institution doesn't allow me to give you money as an incentive, but I can buy you some candy bars while we're here in the interview. If I am allowed by the prison or the jail to provide incentives, some will actually let me make a deposit to the women's canteen account so they could buy things like soaps and slippers and undergarments and things like that. I usually cannot give an incentive that's too high. Usually it's more like $10, because if you give too high of an incentive, then it's seen as sort of an offer that they can't refuse to participate in the research, because they may feel like that's enough of a substantial amount of money that they can't reasonably turn down participation. So those are some aspects of it. Also, there's the responsibility of the research to reasonably protect women from harm during the interview and to maintain their dignity during the interview. An important differentiation in research is whether it's anonymous or confidential. In confidential research, the researcher knows who said what, but they promise that they're not going to link the person's identity to that information. So, for instance, when I do interviews with women at SCDC, I know who told it to me because I was there face to face with them, but I store their information in files that are de-identified. Each case file is assigned a number, and I have a separate index of those numbers that tells me whose file is whose, and it's all password protected, so only I can access it. In contrast to that confidential research in which the researcher knows who's who, there's anonymous research, and that's when even the researcher doesn't know who said what. So for instance, once I was helping the health department do research on sexual risk behavior, and I was asking college students all these very private questions about their number of sexual partners and what behaviors they engaged in, and it was all sorts of different types of sexual behaviors. So when we collected the surveys, we didn't want them to actually feel uncomfortable writing the information on the survey. So they didn't write their name on the survey, they didn't write any identifiers on the survey, and they put it in an envelope, and then they dropped those envelopes into a box. So when I opened the box of surveys, I wouldn't know who had done what with how many whom's in that particular situation. Another part of the ethical obligation of a researcher includes cultural competence in research. So, for instance, research needs to be accessible to persons with disabilities, it needs to be accessible to those who may have English as a second language, and so on. Terminology should be inclusive, like, for instance, one example of non-inclusive terminology that I've seen is on the Nielsen surveys. When you get the television survey to find out about your viewing, they'll have a column that says male head of household, and then they'll have another column that says female head of household. Well, how inclusive is that? What if you don't have both a male and female head of household? What if you have a male male household or a female female household or some other form of a household? So that's one of the things about being inclusive. You need to make sure that people feel comfortable filling out the survey. Researchers also need to be sure that when they're publishing their work, they describe limitations of their study with respect to culture. So once we did a study on mothers at substance abuse treatment uh, agencies, and we actually had to correct the title because we said it was about parenting, and one of the reviewers came back to us and said it's not really about parenting, it's about mothering. So we had to make sure that we were culturally appropriate about that and not implying that it generalized to all parents. An important way to promote cultural competence is to engage with communities throughout the research process. So you could learn about their concerns, include community members as advisors and outreach workers in the research, and try to find ways to give back to communities. When I do research with agencies like SCDC or DJJ, I try to make sure they know that I'll try to present the findings in ways that are usable for them. I could create briefs particularly for them. I'll present to their staff at workshops if they want, and I'll do trainings for them to try to give back. So you try to think of ways that you could actually give a little something to those communities that are helping you out with the research. There's a process by which individuals from minority culture can change once they come into contact with majority or mainstream culture, and this is the degree to which they adopt the mainstream language or lifestyles, and that's referred to as acculturation, and it's an important consideration in cultural competence. So acculturation can happen in degrees, and you still want to make sure that your measures have the same meaning for everyone from a culture. Um, and so that equivalence of meaning that you want your measures to have is called measurement equivalence. And there are three types of measurement equivalence. The first is linguistic equivalence. So if I want my interview protocol to be accessible for Spanish-speaking prisoners, I'd want a bilingual interviewer, but I'd also want my protocol to be translated by an American Translation Association certified translator from English to Spanish, and then back translated by another translator from Spanish to English to make sure that when I take a look at it, that second translation, that the meaning stayed the same, that it's still coming across as linguistically equivalent. Conceptual equivalence is a second type, and that refers to when the concepts used have the same meaning across cultures. So, for instance, some cultures may interpret the term rape differently than others. So, is rape going to be considered by certain cultural norms to be any unwanted sex, or is it just coercion or physical force, or is it just sex that involves penetration? These are all different concepts and ways that the concept is bounded. Metric equivalence is the third type, and that's when the scores on a measure are equivalent across cultural groups. So my Safer Sexual Behavior Scale that I developed for the health department was translated into a bunch of different languages. So ideally, if we took a look at that scale, we'd find that the scores on the different items of the scale, like the internal reliability or how well the items really hang together, would be that they hang together the same for different cultural groups. So for instance, if a bunch of Koreans took the scale and a bunch of Americans took the scale, we would find that their scores were somewhat comparable. So for that third type, it's all about the metric. So thank you for joining me in this lecturette.